Right, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our speaker this morning, and it's Clyde Aylin, and he will be talking to us about this subject that you can see on the screen, the Berlin Wall. So if you care to put your hands together and give him a warm welcome, you can start our speaker.
My background, as you've already gathered, was a military one, and I had, looking back, quite an adventurous career, I think. It was certainly more adventurous than joining the bank or the Prudential Insurance Company. My very first post after commissioning was to the Harz Mountains in January 1956, 2 meters of snow and minus 20 degrees at night. And our job there primarily was to patrol the inner German border, which ran right through the Harz Mountains, with the Soviets and the East Germans on the other side in the forest, and we patrolling on the western side, showing the flag. It was a lovely location, and one or two of you might know the Harz Mountains. Wonderful skiing. We actually went ski training 1 day a week while we were there. That was a short tour. And during that tour, I went with a party of young officers to Berlin in 1956, before the wall was built, and I'll cover that briefly later on. We went up on the famous military train, which is really quite an extraordinary experience. Travel by a train in which you are locked from the inside, not to prevent you getting out, but to prevent the East Germans from jumping on the train and getting to the capitalist paradise in West Berlin. So very briefly, after my tour in Harz Mountains, back to the UK, and then after the war to recapture the Suez Canal, and followed by 3 years in the Middle East in a tent. I loved every minute of it as a young officer. It was 3 years in Cyprus and Libya. And my tour in Cyprus, of course, covered the Yoka campaign and tried to keep the peace between the Greeks and the Turks, who had a nasty habit of cutting each other's heads off. And again, the British Army, like in Northern Ireland, was in the middle, trying to keep the peace between the two conflicting sides. Interesting tour. From there, came back to UK, another tour in Germany with a motorized infantry regiment, and I then was keen to go and join the colonial army, and signed up to join the Ghanaian army, former Gold Coast, and ended up in the Belgian Congo with the United Nations wearing a blue beret during the revolution there in 1961. Absolute chaos, murder, pillage, rape, famine, and part of our job was trying to keep the peace between the warring factions and providing food relief. It was an interesting period because my first tour there ended in the regiment I was with mutinying and being rounded up in shackles down near the Katangan border and flown back to Ghana, court-martialed and sentenced to death by firing squad. The ringleaders ultimately were reprieved by Kwame Nkrumah, who was president at the time. From there, again back to the UK, and some bright spark in the Ministry of Defence thought I ought to go off to the Spanish Army for a year on a mountain warfare course, which was absolutely fascinating. That was in the Central Pyrenees, the Spanish Mountain Warfare School. Of course, Franco was very much on the throne at the time, and the briefing I received at the War Office was that under no circumstance was I to mention the subject of Gibraltar, and my Spanish classmates on my course were very diplomatic. They never raised it either. And I would also urge not to mention Drake, Morgan, or our other pirates who ravished the south coast of Spain. Then back to UK again, a couple of years running around Dartmoor, training soldiers, which I loved very much. We bought our first house near Sidmouth, a lovely part of Devon. And then I got the usual brown envelope marked OHMS on it, and opened it carefully, my next card, and I was off to Hong Kong with the family for 2 years posting as a junior staff officer. And from there we had 2 wonderful holidays in Malaya and Singapore with the family. Back to UK again, tours in Northern Ireland. I was terrified of the bogside in Londonderry. We were there for some of the marches, absolutely frightening. The British Army was not very popular at that time. I then got a posting with the Territorial Army covering the West Country, based in the lovely town of Devizes in Wiltshire, which some of you might know. Was a town which Nicholas Pevsner, who was actually a German-born man, born in Leipzig, liked very much indeed. He admired the architecture there. So 2 happy years there, and I then got a job with the Territorial Army, as I said, in Devizes, and again got my little brown envelope, which said I was to report myself to the Army Language School in Mülheim an der Ruhr, which is about 12 miles north of Düsseldorf, up the Autobahn, in a lovely park-like setting, officers' mess, lovely classrooms, 2 tennis courts, which we used to play at lunchtime. And I was told that my next post was the East German desk, headquarters British Army of the Rhine, providing I passed the written and oral German interpreter exam. And I had 18 months to do it, 8 hours a day. I loved it. To make sure I passed the exam, I used to do 2 hours with a lovely German Anglophile couple in Düsseldorf. And at the end of my 2 hours, practicing my pluperfect tense, my subjunctive and conditional tense in German, would brew a magnificent pear liqueur to finish the evening. He was also a wine connoisseur, and he introduced me to Frankenwein. It comes in a flat green bottle, white wine, which you don't see in the supermarkets here. Absolutely delicious. So the most daunting part of the interpreter exam, of course, is the oral part, but I struggled through, and I took up my post. So, enough of my background. Let's now look at the Berlin Wall and the inner German border. The more I got into the subject, the more I read, the more I realized what a large subject it is, and I hope I haven't got carried away. Nobody has the intention to erect a wall. Walter Ulbricht, June 1961, just 2 months before the wall was actually erected. It's now 28 years since its fall, which was a quite extraordinary event because it was all linked with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The two would not have happened without each other. They were inextricably linked. I like this quotation by Rory MacLean. No other city has repeatedly been so hated, so feared, so loved. No other place has been so twisted and torn. Across centuries of conflict, from religious wars to Cold War, at the hub of Europe's ideological struggle. Rather good, that, isn't it? That was a foreword to one of the books he's written. He's written widely on Eastern Europe. I also like the sentence which sticks in my mind of Ronald Reagan when he visited the wall in 1933, and he looked across to the East Germans who were all photographing him and spying on him, and he said, "Tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev." I'm going to just briefly read you some accounts of the terrible attempted escapes on the wall. Here we go. 9th of June 65. An unknown person died at the wall. That same day, Dieter Branders, 19, were shot at the war. Majority of people who were shot dead trying to cross the war were youngsters. 15th of June 1965, Hermann Döbler, age 42, a West Berliner, who with a female companion was in a paddle boat which strayed across the eastern waters on the Teltow Canal at 1:55 in the afternoon. They were some 60 meters beyond the line. The border guards gave a warning shot, and when that was not heeded, opened fire from a watchtower. Due to the strength of the current, the boat drifted back to the western side, and at about 2:10 reached the bank. Dobler was dead, and the woman was critically injured. Later that year, divers were carrying out exercises, and at 4:05 in the afternoon found parts of the body. I'll just read one more. 25th of April 1966, Michael Calender, aged 21, was shot as he reached the vehicle trap in the death strip. He dived into the vehicle trap, crawled and was shot again. Calender was a member of the National People's Army, the NVA, Nationale Volksarmee, and had a Kalashnikov with him, containing a magazine with 14 rounds. The safety catch was off and the weapon set for continuous fire. He also had a man's watch, a letter addressed to him, a letter from Oberlungwitz, a small place in the south, a purse with 32 marks in it, East German of course, one mail ring and other small items. On the same day, Peter Petermann, aged 58, died at the war. And so it goes on. To the hundreds who have been killed, and we don't actually know how many did die, because it was in the interest of the East Germans, where they could, to cover up the deaths on the wall, because it didn't look good in the Western press, and certainly not in West Germany. To the hundreds who have been killed while trying to scale the wall, the thousands wounded and dragged away before they could reach it, the millions who have been spiritually maimed by its erection in 1961. Now this soldier, Conrad Schumann, who leapt over the wire, was being put up probably on the second or third day in August 61, and conveniently for him there was a photographer on the western side. As he leapt the wire to freedom, he threw away his rifle. Now, he shouldn't have been there in the first place. The agreement at Potsdam with the Soviets, the Americans and ourselves, was that no military German soldier should be stationed in any part of Berlin. You know, right from the beginning, the Soviets flouted this, as they did lots of other things, including harassment all over the sectors in Berlin, harassment on the corridors, harassment on the waterways and on the train. Here we are, devastation in Berlin. You'll notice that there are very few men in these pictures. They're all either dead or still in Russian captivity. Now, that's the next one, is it? Yeah. I'll just point out that a little dog here. She had to look after that dog fairly carefully because dogs were being slaughtered. They were desperate for food, as were the horses. And cats were also slaughtered for their fur, for warmth. Yes, going back to the lack of men, many thousands of German prisoners of war died in Russian captivity with the NKVD. The official Russian figure was 380,000. It was much more than that. It's reckoned that there were probably 1 million who actually died in captivity. Many of them, of course, had been captured at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, dreadful conflict, which was a turning point in the war, for those of you who know your military history. I can recommend Anthony Beevor's book, if anyone is interested in reading about the Battle of Stalingrad, but they had many thousands of men taken into captivity after that battle. The last German prisoners of war were returned by the Soviets in 1956, and it's to his credit that the Catholic Chancellor of Germany at the time, Konrad Adenauer, made strenuous efforts. He made frequent visits to Moscow to get the Soviets to release these men. So, now here she is with a little dog and all her worldly possessions. There was something like 700,000 tons of rubble in Berlin at this time. And those of you who've been to East Berlin after the wall fell will have seen that some of that rubble was still there. They didn't clear it up. With shell holes in the buildings from the Second World War. A complete contrast to the massive reconstruction effort which took place in West Berlin. Electricity was in short supply, a few hours a day, often at night. And later on, when the blockade took place, the Americans flew in a lot of heavy generators to provide electricity. Here we have the Reichstag in flames, and you've probably all seen the iconic photograph of Soviet soldiers planting the Soviet red flag on top of the building. As we all know, our lovely architect Norman Foster rebuilt it. Some of you might well have been back recently and visited it. It was bombed, Germany was bombed by the United States by day generally, and by the Royal Air Force by night. Interesting enough, my father was trained as a Royal Artillery officer, and he was the first air liaison officer with the illustrious Battle of Britain Fighter Squadron at Tangmere, with its takeoff point on the cliffs at Alfriston. I've been in touch there with the museum because I'm presenting a copy of his book to them. Dad flew on bombing raids in Boston and Mitchell medium-fast bombers. And I, as a child, as an 11-year-old boy, witnessed the devastation of war in Hamburg in 1946. At that time, Dad was an officer with the Allied Control Commission in Kiel, and he used to take us for lunch to Hamburg, to the Atlantic or the Four Seasons Hotel, which had been requisitioned by the British and turned into officers' clubs. And they were up and running very quickly. Masses, 40, 50-foot high mounds of rubble lining the streets of Hamburg, 1946, 47. But as you know, the Germans made a miraculous recovery with their economy after the war. In particular, their output of cars. The official British government forecast, when they looked at Volkswagen and Mercedes and BMW, that they wouldn't be producing cars for between 10 and 15 years. In the event, Volkswagen were producing cars, Beetles, within 18 months. And my dad put his name down for one because the first 1,000 were offered to the Allied Control Commission, Government of Occupation, and the British Army. And he got Beetle number 56. The number plate on that was BZ, British Zone, 0056. He had it painted pink and cream, sunshine roof. Yes, happy days. What would that be worth today? He paid the princely sum of £300, the equivalent of Deutschmarks. Yes, they made quite an amazing recovery. Right, so shall we move on? Yes, here's again, this is a familiar photograph, it's clearly posed, of the US forces meeting Soviet troops at Torgau on the Elbe. They were comrades in arms at this time, but we weren't comrades in arms for very long, unfortunately. Friction increased rapidly. Harassment of road, rail and water communication, which led to the Berlin blockade in 1948, which I'll come to a bit later. Both the US and the British government were aware of the dreadful war crimes committed by Stalin, the murder of Polish officers in the forests, and in Poland after he moved west with his agreement with Hitler to occupy that part of Poland. I think we'll move on soon to the next one. Oh, yes, the inner German border. Here we are. This is up, starting near Lübeck in the Baltic, running down through Germany. Now, originally, the American ground forces made tremendous advances.
Can't hear you.
I beg your pardon.
Use the microphone. Use the mic, please. Use the mic, please.
Yeah, sorry. The American forces made considerable gains in the southeast part of eastern Germany towards Leipzig, around the area of Suhl and Erfurt. And Joe Stalin said, could the line be, the inner German border be adjusted so that he actually got back that part of southeastern Germany. The pointer's not working, is it, sir? Let's have it. There we are. So this part here is actually occupied by the Americans, and Stalin asked for the US forces to withdraw to the border as it is there. So the border running from the Baltic here down to the Czechoslovakian border is about 900 miles. And of course, the Iron Curtain itself ran all the way down to the Black Sea. And of course, up in the top corner there, you can see part of the Iron Curtain bordering Finland and the Soviet Union. The Russians and the Finns, of course, were not great friends during the war because they sided with Herr Hitler, and so that caused a certain amount of friction. Now, some brief facts about the East Germany and the GDR. Geographically, it's roughly the size of the island of Ireland. It's about 20% bigger, about 40,000 square miles. That gives you some idea of the landmass. Largely agricultural, of course, but they did have a valuable source of uranium, which the Soviets did exploit whilst they were in occupation of East Germany. Of course, the Ruhr in West Germany was the heart of German industry. And in contrast to the West, the Soviets literally stripped all the factories in their part of Eastern Germany, in Berlin, loaded them out onto rail carts and carried them off. And as an interesting aside there, they were very interested in what made German cars tick. And they took a BMW back to Russia, took it apart and reassembled it. When they reassembled the BMW, they replaced the roundel with a red and white motif instead of a blue and white one. Stalin died in 1953, and shortly before that, a discussion arose about the risk of uprisings and discontent. And this is what he said about the Germans. Why, he said, the Germans will not even cross the road until the traffic lights go green. But as you know, I'll mention it later, very shortly after he died, in June 1953, there was a very serious uprising in Berlin, East Berlin, by the workers, and which was the very first sign of discontent, really, and mutiny in the Soviet puppet regimes. One other interesting aside here, population of, did I mention it, something like 16.5 million people, which was considerably reduced by people fleeing to the West. Some 3.5 million ultimately fled to the West, and these were not the elderly, the unemployed. They were educated doctors, dentists, teachers, engineers. There was a hemorrhage of qualified people fleeing to the West. Here's another interesting fact. Mielke and Honecker sat round the table, and Mielke, the head of the MFS, the Stasi in East Germany, and Honecker was keen to put the details of every single citizen in East Germany on the computer, all 16 million of them. And Mielke turned to him and said, "You can't do that, Eric, because we have so many power cuts here. The computers will keep on crashing." Okay, so shall we move on? And so, the division of the zones now in Germany, post-war Germany. This was the new border with Poland along the line of the Oder-Neisse River. And as you'll see, Berlin, right in the middle, about 100 miles from the border with the West here, 100 miles. The British in the north here, that's where it was quite a while. The port of Bremen there was, at the request of Eisenhower, given to the Americans. Eisenhower was very keen to get access to a seaport, so he was given Bremen, and Bremerhaven. French down here in the southwest, very nice, beautiful part of Germany. I visited frequently on exchanges of intelligence with the French in the Black Forest, and the American zone here, and Munich. I used to visit Munich on visits to the Bundesnachrichtendienst, which is the German, West German Cheltenham, really. So why did the Russians get to Berlin first? Well, you know, with hindsight, it was the wisdom of Eisenhower. The war was coming to an end. We were clearly going to win it, but we still had to win the war in Japan. And was he going to sacrifice perhaps hundreds of thousands or more American lives, American soldiers, in fighting for Berlin, house to house, bitter street battles? So we left it to the Soviets. But of course, we ended up with this extraordinary position of Berlin being right there in the middle. Okay, Sue, how are we doing for time? Behind. What are we looking at now? Oh yes, here we are. Berlin. Again, it was divided up into zones, yellow showing the Soviet sector, and the French up there in the north, and they had the airport at Tegel. John, you want to Royal Air Force, aren't you? Did you also? No? No, sorry. And here we are, the Brits, Spandau with the prison where Hess was incarcerated, along with Dönitz and the others. The prison has been demolished a few years ago, because it was feared it would become a shrine to the right wing and the ex-Nazis. So that has now gone. So the Brits were basically in Charlottenburg. The soldiers used to refer to it when you asked them where they were stationed. I was stationed in Charlotte. It was quite a nice part of Berlin, actually. We had an airbase right down here called Royal Air Force Gatow, which is only a couple of kilometres over the border. Now, when we talk about the war itself, most people visualise it as
Can
going...
you use the microphone, please? Can't be heard.
Sorry. Yeah. When we talk about the wall, we talk about this going through the middle of Berlin, which was created on the weekend 13th, 14th of August 1961. Great secrecy and great skill, actually. But the wall actually encompassed the whole of West Berlin, all the way around. The West Berliners were totally incarcerated. And I also, while thinking about incarceration in West Berlin, somebody said the only free people in Berlin are those incarcerated in West Berlin. They were free in spirit. They were free in what they could read, what they could think. It wasn't easy to travel. We were basically hostages to fortune. The Allied forces in Berlin, something like 2,000, many of whom were on R&R, rest and recreation from the war in Algeria. And it was quite a pleasant place to serve for a couple of years. The British contingent was about 3,000, including Royal Air Force Gatow. And the Americans down here in the southern sector, what we used to refer to as downtown Dahlem, about 5,000. And we were opposed by, in the immediate area of Berlin, something like 250,000 armed personnel, and a total in East Germany altogether, something like 400,000, something like 19 German tank divisions. There was a plan to reinforce Berlin, but we were really hostages to fortune. Okay, shall we move on, Sid? Some of you might know this place. It's, I don't think they've decided what to do with it yet. This is the headquarters, British Army of the Rhine, and headquarters of Northern Army Group, the NATO organisation, which is where I worked for 6 years when I was in the office. My office is somewhere down here. Opaque glass and iron bars, but my colleagues in Royal Air Force Intelligence and Photo Interpretation were right at the other end of the building, which is about a 1 kilometre walk, and so it was quite pleasant to get out of the office and walk down the corridors for a break and get some fresh air. We used to go underground for 2 weeks in the year, normally about October, November, when the weather got fairly gloomy. We were flown out in Chinook helicopters to some secret location near the Dutch border, and we spent 2 weeks underground like moles. And if you were on the night shift, you didn't see daylight for you did a 12-hour shift, you didn't see daylight at all. We accommodated in hotels in the area, and it was hot bedding. Somebody came in and made the bed after you left, and another officer came in and occupied it while you were away on shift underground. Right, the next one, Sue. Now, this is the inner German border in about the 1950s. Pretty easy to get through, really. If you knew the terrain, or you could bribe some of the guards, it wasn't really a great problem. And the refugee trickle initially was a fairly small one, which subsequently became an absolute torrent. It reached at a peak 4,000 people fleeing from East Germany a week, 4,000. And Berlin was the escape hatch. If they got to Berlin, to the Marienfelder refugee camp, they could then be flown out to West Germany. And their flight was subsidized by the West German government, which was an incentive to leave. That latterly led to a grave shortage of labour in West Berlin after the war went up. And the West German government made efforts to overcome that by encouraging people and offering incentives to go back to West Berlin and plug the gap. So we're looking now at around 1948, and the big event in 1948 was the introduction of the Deutschmark, wonderful Deutschmark, and and German economy was then starting really to look up. I had a friend in Minden on the Weser who benefited from the scheme by which the German Chancellor provided not a loan but a grant. He gave you, I think, 5,000 Deutschmarks to help you build your house, and that did help the recovery enormously. In the car industry, as the Germans manufactured thousands of their cars and exported them and got lots of money back in return, they converted their Deutschmarks into gold. And Germany today has the second largest holding of gold reserves in the world after the United States. Now that gold, up until 2 years ago, was all stashed in Frankfurt. Frankfurt's only about an hour and a half's run to the East German border and the Soviets, and that wasn't a very good idea. So they shipped it out to New York, London and Paris, and it came back, I think last year or the year before, back to Frankfurt when the Cold War had ended, or so we hope. Okay, how are we doing, Sue? Time? Yeah, okay, next one. So here we are. The air corridors. 3 air corridors agreed with the Soviets, and there was a joint air control safety center in Berlin itself, which had Soviet officers represented there. You'll see Buchenberg marked there. I actually was stationed there for a while, but the actual airbase there was Bad Eilsen, which is a few kilometers to the east. So 3 air corridors. They were only 20 miles wide, and there was a height restriction. And there was frequent buzzing of aircraft using the corridors by the Soviets. There was one collision, a mid-air collision, with a Yak Soviet fighter and a BEA Viking, which resulted in about 20 people dying. Right, I think we might move on. Right, this is the Royal Air Force Pembroke aircraft, which was modified with cameras underneath there, that protrusion in the middle of the belly of the aircraft. This aircraft flew on intelligence gathering missions from Royal Air Force of Wildenrath, just to the west of Mönchengladbach, almost daily flights, taking photographs of mainly Soviet military installations along the way. There was a drill in case they were shot down or forced to land, because they then had to get rid of their cameras in a hurry. But fortunately, they survived. They weren't shot down, they weren't forced to land. There is a very good book about the intelligence gathering which the Royal Air Force conducted, which was published last year, and it's called Looking Down the Corridors. Very good book, which I recommend if you're interested in that aspect of military intelligence. Okay, how are we doing time? Here we go, 1948. I actually was a schoolboy at a school in Germany, the boarding school established for British kids, members of the armed forces and the Control Commission. And I remember the headmaster getting up and telling us about this amazing event, how the Soviets had cut off Berlin, West Berlin, from access by water, by road and by rail. And the Allies mounted the largest air lift operation ever conducted in history. Massive, round-the-clock operation with aircraft landing and taking off every 90 seconds from the three airfields I mentioned earlier, the one at Tegel in the French sector, the one in Gatow in the British sector, and Tempelhof. To increase the capacity, German women were actually largely used to lay another runway at Tegel in the French sector, which they achieved in very quick time. A total of 300,000 flights in all, 700 aircraft, including approximately 100 civilian aircraft, also took part in the event. You'll see their sacks being used because much of the material brought in was coal, very dusty stuff and difficult to handle, and it didn't please the air crews very much, so it was all carried in sacks, as was the salt. Salt was also a primary requirement, I think primarily for de-icing the roads and the runways, but also for food, condiments. And that again wasn't a good material when it gets wet inside an aircraft for damage to the inside of the aircraft and the wiring. Okay, here we are. An aircraft like this had a capacity of about 7,000 tons. Here you see West Berlin kids waiting for the parachutes to float down with chewing gum and chocolate bars, which the pilots used to do as they came into land. Just extraordinary, isn't it? Just 6 years, 10 years before this, these aircraft were dropping bombs on Berlin, and now they were bringing food relief to them and saving their lives. Okay? Now, isn't this a lovely photograph? This is a Sunderland flying boat. My ambition as a boy was to fly in one of these, and it must have been very exciting landing on the water, particularly if it was choppy. Because you know, British BOAC had these in service around the world when we had an empire. And I just wondered, perhaps one day they will make a comeback. But it must have been great fun. This is on the Havel, which is the lake running down the western side of Berlin. Carried freight of about 5,000 tons. 5,000 tons, yes. And was then offloaded into these barges and taken to the shore. Okay? Inevitably, there were accidents, but considering the volume of flights flown and the frequency of them, it's quite amazing that there weren't more casualties. Some 80 Air Force personnel lost their lives, and one Royal Australian and one South African. Approximately 100 people died in total, including civilians. The Tempelhof airfield, because it was being used so frequently, it became badly eroded, and the Royal Air Force and the Americans flew in metal corrugated sections which they clipped together to use as landing strips to offset the corrosion on the strips themselves. Right, next one. Hurrah! The blockade ends. The Soviets realized they were losing the war. They were losing the propaganda war. And we won the battle. And the blockade was lifted in May '49. And the Soviets then, and Herr Honecker and Walter Ulbricht, had to think of other ways of trying to get the Allies in West Berlin out. Yes, Khrushchev described West Berlin as being a bone stuck in his throat. He just desperately wanted to cut it out. He also described it as being the cancer of Berlin. But he also said West Berlin is also the testicles of the Allies. And when we want to, we can twist them and put the pressure on them. One of his plans, after he surrendered his efforts to drive us out of West Berlin, was to declare the city, the whole city, an open city with UN monitors. But the Allies quickly saw through that and rejected it. Right, okay, so this is a monument created by a German architect, and it symbolizes the three prongs of the air corridor, the one in the north from Hamburg, Lübeck, the one in the middle from Celle, Hanover, and the one in the south from the Munich Munich area. The other one is at the other end of the American section at Tempelhof in Frankfurt. It was an enormous moral victory for the West. The fact that we had stood up to the bullying of the Soviets and not been forced out of Berlin. It was an amazing achievement, quite an amazing achievement, quite unique in history. Okay, now why am I showing you this? This goes back to my first tour in the Harz Mountains. This is an Austin Champ, which was the British answer to the American Jeep. Greatly over-engineered, extremely expensive. It cost £1,200 in 1950, about almost double what the Land Rover cost. And it had a Rolls-Royce engine, which was waterproofed, and a snorkel. I remember driving this one in the Harz Mountains in minus 20 degrees with no canopy, no door, no cab. There you see the snorkel. That is then erected horizontally, and you could go underwater to a depth of 2 meters, 6 feet. I'm not sure how the driver would have coped. He needed a snorkel, but I never tried it. But the British Army, as you know, liked the Land Rover, and it was sold off to some foreign armies or whatever, and we went and travelled in Land Rovers, the Austin Champ. Okay, so I think we'll move on. Right, here we go back to the checkpoints. 3 major checkpoints, Alpha, Bravo and Charlie. Alpha was at Helmstedt, close to Hanover, as you left Western Germany. You were briefed, made sure you had all your documents, because as you know in Germany you can't do anything without your identity card. And you were briefed about your journey and the risks therein. You were to travel and arrive not before a certain time and not after a certain time. And this is the days before mobile phones, so I often wonder what happened if you broke down. I think a military police Land Rover would have gone out and rescued you, but it's quite an interesting journey. The Autobahn then was basically completely empty. There was no traffic on it for miles. And it was really quite eerie, that. It was certainly not like the M25. If you were arrested or halted by East German soldiers or policemen, Volkspolizei, you were to politely exchange courtesies and refuse to show them any of your documents, but to ask the East German to summon a Soviet officer. As you know, the West Germans were very keen that we should not recognize the Deutsche Demokratische Republic, the GDR. In fact, it wasn't recognized officially for many years. Okay, Sue, then the next one. Here's another photograph of the flags of the Allies, Helmstedt, Hanover. And then checkpoint Bravo, this is the other end as you came into Berlin. More checks. Once while leaving Berlin on a visit by car, he came to a Soviet soldier and he had his millboard like this, checking our documents and our number. He came along, the Soviet soldier, as we were leaving Berlin, to drive back down the Autobahn, and checking the numbers and the documents. And then suddenly he flicked over his millboard, and on the back of his millboard he had a dozen cap badges, and he wanted to swap them for cigarettes, for Western cigarettes. Oh my God. Checkpoint Charlie. Yeah. Yeah, with the standoff. Yes, there. That was a very serious standoff. We were very close to war if someone had opened fire. Next one. U2 spy. Prior to the fall of the war, the United States had been severely embarrassed by the shooting down of Gary Powers. And of course Khrushchev made the most of this. He parachuted out. He got 10 years, 3 years jail and 7 years hard labor. But he was exchanged, as you know, later on, and I'll cover that in a moment. Right, the war. The war. Built in great secrecy over the weekend, 13th, 14th of August. The wire and a lot of the materials were supplied by Great Britain and West Germany. When they came to unfurl the rolls of wire, which they put down initially, they saw the tags on it said made in Great Britain. So they quickly removed them. How could they possibly have a fascist capitalist West imprisoning their own peace-loving people? Right. The wall. Yes, sir. Here we are. Here's the wall in more detail. 5 kilometre strip at the back there, the north, at the top of the picture, and anybody who had any relatives living in the West was moved out because they were high risk. They were at high risk of trying to escape. Watchtowers, dogs on leads, electrified fences, searchlights, tank traps, horrendous. Next one, please. This is the notorious SM-70. I think it probably Selbstschutzmine, which fired hundreds of shrapnel splinters at head height as you tripped the wire underneath. It was horizontal to the fence as people tried to climb over. Interesting enough, that probably for propaganda reasons, the East Germans didn't put it up on the wall in Berlin. It was along the inner German border. Eventually, there was such outrage over this weapon and so much publicity about it in the West, in West German newspapers, that they dismantled it in the later 70s. Next one, please. So, the Brandenburg Gate, the famous Victory quadriga on the top, which was taken by Napoleon back in the early 19th century, and then recovered by the Germans during the Franco-Prussian War after they defeated France. And Hitler added to it by putting an eagle on the top and an iron cross. It's called the quadriga because it was pulled by 4 horses. There you'll see these vehicles are the part of the Bereitschaftspolizei, the riot police, heavily armed, who would be used in the first instance. The East Germans and the Russians were terrified that by erecting the wall, that it would lead to a much larger conflict. And Khrushchev knew that his head would roll if that happened. So they tried to keep it down to a low level by, first of all, deploying the Bereitschaftspolizei rather than the Russian tanks in front there, the Brandenburg Gate. What else? There's no doubt about it. Without the construction of the wall, the GDR would have collapsed. It was joked that the only people left in East Germany, East Berlin, would have been Walter Ulbricht and his mistress. And the other joke was the last person out switch off the lights. They were hemorrhaging at an alarming rate. It would have broken up. And that would have led, undoubtedly, to a vacuum, which would have been much more serious. So I think, ultimately, John Kennedy was quite pleased that the wall went up. It did stabilise things in Central Europe. Okay, this is an interesting one. The Glienicke Bridge, the Bridge of Spies across the Havel. This leads to Potsdam, where the British, the French and the American missions were based. They used to report to me, my job. They used to provide me lots of interesting intelligence. The inscription on the top there says, Brücke der Einheit, Bridge of Unity. How ironic is that? A confrontation between East and West, with the white line down the middle, where the spies were exchanged. Extraordinary. I haven't seen the film, Bridge of Spies. Mark Rylance and Tim Hanks, apparently. Apparently it's very good. It was on this bridge that Gary Powers was swapped for notorious Russian spy Rudolf Abel, who actually was very lucky that the Americans didn't execute him. That was 1960. He was a key spy. When Nathan Sharansky came across, he wasn't a spy, Sharansky. He was an Israeli Jew, a dissident, who the Soviets had tortured and imprisoned for 9 long years. It's worth reading his book. Very brave man indeed. Fear No Evil was his book. When he came across, the journalists noticed he was holding up his pants. And they said the Russians must have starved him. Not a bit of it. They had taken away his braces so he couldn't hang himself. Right. Next one, please. This, I think, epitomizes the absurdity of the inner German border. This is a little hamlet, 2,000 people, called Spanberg on the River Saale down in Thuringia, right up, the border actually was the river itself, Saar. And they again were walled in. A company of East German border guards was stationed there to make sure no one jumped over the wall. And they had one entrance and one exit. If somebody was seriously ill in the night, they had to wait till the following morning because there was a curfew at night, no movement was allowed. Children had to be bussed out under escort to school. So, not a very happy situation. It's actually surprising that they didn't demolish it, but they decided not to. On the other side of the river, yes, there was a night curfew, as I said. On the other side of the river was this lovely little hamlet of Rudolfstein. And they used to play football with each other, go to each other's pubs, socialise, intermarry. But that, of course, all ceased with the erection of the wall. Each village had its own little umpire band, and they used, on May the 1st, the East Germans would play, and the village of Rudolfstein would respond, and they'd wave to each other across the river. Extraordinary situation. But it just highlights the absurdity and pathos of the whole thing. Yeah, here we go, next one. Here we are, John Kennedy, Willy Brandt, and Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. 1963, the year we were married. Lyndon Johnson had been sent there earlier by Kennedy, but Kennedy came at this stage. The West Berliners were incensed that we didn't send in the tanks and start a Third World War, but it didn't make any sense. And as I said earlier, Kennedy was really relieved about the wall's erection. I think he got it right. Okay, next one please. Here he is on the stand, and we all remember his famous speech. He announced proudly, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Well, a Berliner is actually a donut, but it is also a fizzy fruit drink, like a shandy. So the Germans got the message there. He was on their side. It's a lovely story. You can see these Germans there, these guys are taking photographs of him. One of the visits by one of the Western heads, they actually hung massive red drapes down the front of the Brandenburg Tor, so they couldn't look through with the East German flag. Okay, the escapes.
No.
Okay. The escapes, the balloon escape. Amazing achievement. How brave they were. No prior practice. Child sedated, 2-year-old child, sedated, so he wouldn't scream and wake everybody up. The next one, please. The Trojan cow, the tunnel. Berlin is built on sand, and the tunnels there had to be reinforced, of course. The next one, yes, the Austin Healey Sprite, with the lowered windscreen, tire pressures reduced, and they got away with it. Next one, please. The escapes across the Baltic. More than 5,600 East Germans tried to escape the GDR across to Denmark primarily. It was easier, really. It was a shorter route, of course, to Lübeck, down the coast, but that was heavily patrolled and guarded. This little man here in the middle, he created his underwater scooter, and with a snorkel, he successfully got across the Baltic to Denmark. Quite extraordinary. Approximately 900 East Germans managed to escape across the Baltic. Now, the next one. This is quite amazing. He decided he would cross the lake, the frozen lake, underwater with a snorkel, and he kept, in order to keep his weight down, keep his feet on the bottom, he had a heavy lead belt. And this was Hubert Holbein, 21 years old. Spent much of his life in West Berlin, and when the war went up, he didn't want to stay in East Berlin. He made his own diving suit and used it to cross a frozen lake with a lead belt to stop him from floating upwards. And he walked slowly across the bottom of the lake. It took 1.5 hours, but he succeeded. Amazing. Quite amazing. This is a successful attempt, a disused railway track, and they used a train to get across. The other attempt here at the bottom with the stolen tank did not succeed. Right, the next one. This is those of you who read about our notorious spy George Blake, when they were all about this tunnel, because he betrayed it to the Soviets. This was the tunnel built southwest of Berlin, ostensibly as a communications safety tower, and they were tunneling underneath and tapping into Soviet communications. An absolute treasure trove of information was received. It was betrayed by Blake, and here are the photographs, which of course the Soviets seized upon as an example of the nasty allies. It's worth reading the story of George Blake and how he got out of Wormwood Scrubs. Fascinating story. Next one, please. The collapse of the wall. Isn't that a great photograph? It all came about shortly after the 40th anniversary of the GDR, when Gorbachev came to Berlin and he said, look, I'm not going to bail you out this time. I'm not going to send in the Russian tanks, as he hadn't done in Poland. He said, you're on your own. He created what was known as the Sinatra doctrine. I'll do it my way. And he had been, Gorbachev said, look, standards of living in East Germany and Hungary are higher than in the Soviet Union. And I'm sending you cheap raw materials, and you're sending me back cheap goods which you manufacture. And I'm your guarantor for your massive loans from Western governments, in particular the West Germans. And I'm not going to guarantee those anymore. You're on your own, boy. And he made it quite clear that he would not send in the tanks. And this, of course, led to the collapse of the wall. The East Germans used to go on holiday with their camper vans and their trabbies to Lake Balaton in Hungary. The Hungarians didn't have a great problem with their fence. It was said that it was only people men who wanted to escape their wives who jumped over the fence there. And Nemeth said to Gorbachev, I'm going to dismantle this fence. I can't afford to replace it. It's $50 million. And Gorbachev said, go ahead. So the East Germans came across into Austria. They then besieged the embassy in Prague, and the East Germans said, well, send them back to us. And they sent them back in a sealed train to Dresden, where there was a huge riot at Dresden, and the travellers in the train, the East Germans were fleeing, had great pleasure when they were asked for their passes and their tickets. They threw them down at the feet of the Stasi on the train. And very interesting story then. Right, how am I doing? Oh yes. Just one last thing. The British Secret Service built a tunnel in Vienna. Vienna was occupied until 1955. Again, the four sectors. And we again decided to dig a tunnel under the road to tap into the communications landline box. And the front for that was a little shop would be opened while they were digging down below in the cellar. And they advertised it as being an import agency for the quintessential British product, Harris Tweed. So they got half a dozen rolls of Harris Tweed. And then to their amazement, the Viennese suddenly fell in love with Harris Tweed. They were absolutely bombarded with queries about people wanting to buy it, so they had to employ a woman to cover this and get many more bolts of cloth while they were digging holes underneath in the cellar. It's a fascinating story. Right, so
I find things like this, when they put actual photographs to the point of what's actually discussed, it gives a wider outlook rather than just listening to somebody give a talk. The photographs or pictures, they just complete the story. So on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for coming this morning and telling us all about a little bit of your life's history.